Welcome to my site. This is part 5 of my series on long lost Oldham pubs. And please, don't forget, like, subscribe and hit that bell to get notifications when I load the next one. Joseph Wood, who took over in 1843, stayed for 26 years, despite having the occasional brush with the law. He was once fined 30 shillings for serving ale on a Sunday morning, and in 1858 he was fined the same amount for opening on Good Friday. Another Joseph Wood, his son, took over in 1870, and he renamed the pub the Moorside in 1878. Garside's Brewery of Ashton were the owners by the 1904. There were major alterations at the Moorside in 1957 when a new outdoor shop front was added to the building. This shop was licensed from 1858 until 1976. The Moorside became a Bass Charrington pub in 1969 and today is owned by Bass Northwest. In 1809, John Ogden left the Angel, Oldham's principal inn, and soon afterwards opened a spirit vault and public house on Manchester Street, which he called the Royal Horse Guards. This was almost certainly the pub which became the Moulder's Arms. James Howard, who had a joinery business on Manchester Street, took over the pub, which became the Moulders shortly after 1825. The 1829 survey shows him as the sole owner. About 1831, William Green, who had a small foundry at the rear of the pub, purchased it, took the licence and named it the Dog Inn. By 1833 he had changed the name to the more apt Moulder's Arms, and in the 1836 directory he is listed as a victualler and iron founder. The Moulder's Arms continued in business until 1939, when the police objected to the licence. The magistrate decided the pub was no longer needed and referred it to the Compensation Authority, who awarded the licensee, Albert Brennan, £200 in compensation after he closed the doors for the last time in June 1939. John Dalton, a hatter and seedsman, kept the Royal Oak, the Trap Inn, on Rochdale Road from 1812 until 1817, and the following year he was listed as a hatter and shopkeeper in Cheapside. In 1823, John obtained an alehouse licence for his shop and gave it the apt name of the Gardener's Arms. The 1829 survey reveals the pub covered an area of 108 square yards and the owner of the building was Samuel Kershaw. About 1846 the Gardener's Arms became the Museum Tavern, and by 1858 it was the Museum Inn, a name which it kept until it closed when the town celebrated the wedding of the Prince of Wales in 1863. The licence of the museum, John Newby, decorated the outside of the pub with a large illuminated star. A music licence was granted in 1870. The museum probably didn't get the required attention. It was a very old property and stood on the west side of Cheapside, almost facing a narrow entry to Henshaw Street. Part of this still exists at the side of Greenwood Shop. The museum was closed in December 1909. The Bricklayers Arms was not renamed the Mutual Inn until the 1850s. The licensee, who was probably responsible for the name change, was John Buckley, whose brief tenancy was tarnished by a fine of 10 shillings for serving outside permitted hours on a Monday night in 1857. Robert Wrigley took over later that year, and he gave the pub yet another name, the Gardener's Arms. The final change was made about 1860 when Thomas Whitehead took over and the pub became the Mutual Inn. Once more, Thomas made a name for himself when he was charged with permitting persons of notorious character to assemble in the pub at midnight on Friday the 20th of May 1864. He kept the licence for at least another 9 years, even though police complained in 1868 and 1869 that the Mutual was a haunt of thieves and prostitutes, and no effort was being made to change things. Robert Whitehead took out a licence for an alehouse situated where the Oldham branch of the Ashton Canal passed under the road to Manchester. There was already a licensed house called the Navigation at Stake-Leach, so he called his house the New Navigation Inn. In 1982, after a short period of closure, Paul Davidson took over and decided to give the pub a new image. He changed the name to Whispers. 2 years later, Derek Heap came from the Crown, Walsh Street, Cheriton, and the pub became the Navigation again. In the late 1980s, many former Wilson's houses were leased to tenants under the Entrepreneur scheme, and some were sold. A few local pubs ended up as Blizzard's houses, and others were purchased by Belhaven Properties Limited. The Navigation was one of the latter and now sells Tetley ales. The Nelson was originally called the Buck and Union and is first listed in 1825. James Tattersall gave the pub its present name when he took over in 1854. Mr. Tattersall was in serious trouble. 2 years later, following the death of his wife, Martha Tattersall's body was found to be covered in bruises, and James was suspected of beating her, which he denied at the inquest. It was revealed that she had been drinking, and James explained that his wife had once been committed to the workhouse because of her drinking. He had last seen her on the night she died, when she went to bed with a pint of whisky and hot water. The verdict was death through extreme drinking. Life may henceforth have been a little quieter for James, but he got into trouble in 1857 when he was fined 10 shillings for out-of-hours drinking at 3:30 p.m. on a Sunday. In 1900, Fufu Lamar took the Nelson on lease from Whitbread and installed a series of managers. This alehouse stood on the ancient road over the edge to Royton, and it can be traced back to 1793. Although it may have been much older, Jonathan Rayner took the licence in that year. The house didn't have a sign until 1805, when it was recorded as the Marquis de Cornwallis, a British general who died in 1804. The name was corrected to Lord Cornwallis in 1812. The final change of name came in the early 1840s when John Wilde, who had been running a shop on Lord Street, took over and called the pub the Odd House. The choice of name may be connected with the pub's association with the Oddfellows Society, which continued for years after Jonathan Rayner's death. The Rose of Sharon Lodge was formed at the pub in 1856 and the Economy Lodge in 1862. Oldham Brewery made some major alterations to the pub in 1962 and again in 1966. In the latter year, Bryn Day, a former rugby international and previously landlord of the Boundary Inn, he was the Odd House's last licensee, as the pub was the subject of a compulsory purchase order and closed in April 1969. The names Slaughterhouse and Old Mess House are believed to refer to the time when a detachment of dragoons was billeted in the town to keep order following the Peterloo massacre. Public houses such as the Angel, the Bull's Head and the Red Lion had to provide accommodation for the soldiers, who seemed to have attracted more trouble than they cooled. James Buckley took over and he renamed the Red Lion the Old Mess House. In October 1969, Bryn and Sheila Day took over at the Old Mess House. Bryn was an ex-rugby international and between them they had kept over half a dozen pubs. Sadly, Bryn died in 1977. But Sheila carried on until 1990, and after 21 years at the pub, she was the longest serving licensee for over 200 years. In 1992, the Old Mess House closed for another refurbishment, and the latest in the pub's Mary Riley was the licensee in 1860. Mary's wholesale price list was as follows. Fine old pale brandy, 20 shillings a gallon. Fine old brown brandy, 20 shillings a gallon. Very superior port wine, 52 shillings a dozen bottles. Best port wine, 46 shillings a dozen bottles. Second best port wine, 40 shillings a dozen bottles. Good port wine, 30 shillings a dozen bottles. Fine old pale sherry, 42 shillings a dozen. Good old pale sherry, 30 shillings a dozen. Mary Ross was in charge at the old post office in 1864, so perhaps Mary Riley had married William Ross. She stayed until 1870, then another wine and spirits merchant, Robert S. Cowanbrook, took over in 1872. The old post office was bought by Charles Buckley of 32 Yorkshire Street. The old post office was owned by William Forsyth and Company of Yorkshire Street from about 1908, and the doors closed for the last time on the 20th of September 1924. The building was then used as a shop before being demolished in 1930. Long history. The earliest date for the Old Soldier is 1822, when the alehouse was kept by Thomas Booth. John Booth, his son, took over in 1825. The Nimrod Lodge of the Ancient Order of Foresters was formed at the Old Soldier in 1860, and in 1877 the True Britain Lodge met in the concert room every month. The Old Soldier had 4 tenants between 1895 and 1906, then achieved some stability from 1906 to 1923, when it was kept by Tom Sellers. After 4 more short tenancies, the Old Soldier closed for the last time on the 18th of July 1928. The White Hart on North Moor was opened on the 27th of September 1790 by Edward Barlow, but there may have been an alehouse on or near the site half a century before then. The opening of the White Hart was noted by Rowbottom, who remarked that as with other alehouses, the event was graced with uncommon fighting. Worse was to come. James Ogden took the pub on the 21st of December 1810, but he was relieved of his licence in late 1815, and in 1816 was committed for trial at the New Bailey prison in Salford for being in possession of stolen beaver fur. The indisposed Mr. Ogden then leased the White Hart to Peter Holt. By the late 1860s, the White Hart was owned by Samuel Holt, and in November 1875 he had the pub completely refronted. A few years later it became the Old White Hart. The addition of the Old was probably to establish the pub's seniority over other White Harts. Webster's Brewery was merged with Wilson's in 1984, but there was a bigger change for the White Hart in August 1988, when the pub was one of several purchased by Banks Brewery of Wolverhampton. A lot of the information that I got for this video comes from this excellent book by Rob McGee. Oh, and please don't forget, like, subscribe and hit that notification bell to be aware of next time I upload one.